Imagine being violently kidnapped on your wedding day while your own parents cheer and applaud. In ancient Rome, this wasn't a nightmare. It was a required romantic tradition that every bride had to endure. Roman wedding nights weren't about love or intimacy. They were systematic sexual ordeals designed to publicly humiliate women, while entire communities watched and celebrated. From ritualized kidnapping to forced inspections of your most private moments, Romans turned marriage into organized trauma. Today we're diving into the most disturbing wedding traditions of ancient Rome. These weren't isolated incidents by cruel families. These were legally required customs that the most civilized empire in history considered essential to proper romance. The same civilization that gave us beautiful love poetry also created wedding customs so brutal they would be considered criminal assault today. What if I told you that Roman weddings began with ritualized kidnapping that everyone celebrated as romantic? Crazy, right? Imagine you're a Roman bride on your wedding day. You've spent months preparing for this moment. Your hair is elaborately braided, your dress is pure white silk, and your family has paid an enormous dowry. But as evening approaches, instead of walking gracefully to your new home, something terrifying happens. Your new husband arrives with a group of his friends, not to escort you, but to literally capture you. And believe me, this isn't gentle role play. It's violent theater designed to demonstrate that you're being taken against your will. The men grab you roughly, you're supposed to scream and fight back, and your wedding dress gets torn in the struggle. But here's the most disturbing part. Your own family helps orchestrate this kidnapping. Your father hands you over while you beg him not to. Your mother watches approvingly as you're dragged away crying. And your relatives cheer as if they're watching entertainment rather than assault. The bride capture wasn't symbolic. It was visceral and traumatic. Roman writers describe brides who were genuinely terrified, not because they didn't understand it was theater, but because the violence felt real. Some brides were injured during these captures, suffering bruises and cuts that were considered proof of an authentic ceremony. Your wedding guests don't intervene to help you. They throw flower petals and shout encouragement to your captors. The more you struggle, the more successful the ceremony is considered. Roman marriage manuals actually gave advice on how brides should resist effectively without actually escaping. And if you didn't fight back convincingly enough, the ceremony could be declared invalid, and you'd have to do it again until your terror looked genuine to the watching crowd. But as shocking as this kidnapping ritual was, it was only the beginning of your wedding night ordeal. Now that you've been captured and brought to your new home, you might think the public humiliation is over. You'd be wrong. Romans had a tradition that would make modern families recoil in horror: the defloration inspection. Picture this. You've just arrived at your husband's house, traumatized from the capture ceremony, and now you're told that before anything intimate can happen, you need to be examined. Not by a doctor, not in private, but by your new mother-in-law and other female relatives who will physically inspect you to confirm your virginity. This wasn't a gentle medical procedure. Roman women would use their fingers to check for an intact hymen, often causing pain and bleeding, even before the wedding night began. They'd examine you like livestock at market, discussing your body while you stood there naked and humiliated. But the inspection didn't end there. After your wedding night, these same women would return to examine you again, looking for evidence that consummation had occurred. They'd check for blood, tears, and signs of trauma that proved your husband had successfully deflowered you. The results of both inspections were documented and often made semi-public. Your mother-in-law might announce to the extended family whether you'd passed both examinations. Failed inspections could void your marriage contract, force your family to return the dowry, and brand you as either impure or defective. Some Roman families kept written records of these inspections, storing them like property deeds. If your marriage later faced legal challenges, these intimate examination reports could be presented as evidence in court. Roman medical writers recommended specific techniques for conducting these inspections, treating women's bodies as mechanical objects that could be tested for functionality. They even suggested tools and implements that would make the examinations more thorough and accurate. The psychological trauma of these inspections was considered irrelevant. What mattered was legal proof that the transaction, because that's what marriage was, had been completed according to specifications. And speaking of proof, Romans had an even more disturbing way of ensuring everyone knew your wedding night had been successful. Here's something that will change how you see Roman privacy forever. Wedding guests didn't go home until they had proof that the marriage had been consummated, and they expected to hear it happen. You and your new husband are finally alone in the bridal chamber, but you're not really alone. Outside your door, dozens of wedding guests are waiting, listening, and expecting to hear evidence of your intimate encounter. They're not going home until they're satisfied that consummation has occurred. The pressure is immense. You know that friends, family members, and neighbors are pressed against the door, straining to hear sounds that confirm you're fulfilling your marital duties. Some Roman houses even had special rooms designed for wedding nights with thinner walls, so the sounds would carry better to the waiting crowd. Roman men were expected to make the encounter loud enough for witnesses to hear, which meant the experience was often more violent than intimate. The goal wasn't pleasure or connection. It was creating audible proof for the listening audience. Brides were expected to cry out in pain because silence suggested the consummation wasn't vigorous enough to be legitimate. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. If you and your husband couldn't perform under this pressure, and many couples couldn't, wealthy Roman families had a backup plan. They would hire actors to create the sounds of consummation while the real couple hid in shame. Professional consummation actors were a real occupation in ancient Rome. These performers specialized in creating convincing audio performances of defloration and intimate encounters. They knew exactly what sounds crowds expected to hear and how long the performance should last. Some Roman writers documented cases where couples spent their wedding night listening to hired actors perform their consummation while they sat fully clothed, too terrified or disgusted to touch each other. The next morning, they'd have to pretend the performance had been their own. The crowd outside wouldn't leave until they heard the specific sounds they expected: initial resistance, escalating struggle, cries of pain, and then eventual submission. It was like a checklist of trauma that had to be audibly confirmed. And when morning came, the public humiliation reached its peak with a tradition that turned private pain into community celebration. Now, you might think that Roman religious customs would bring some dignity to the wedding night experience. Instead, they made it even more intrusive and bizarre. Romans believed that the wedding night required elaborate fertility rituals that turned intimate moments into religious performances. Before you could be alone with your husband, priests had to bless your reproductive organs and give detailed instructions on exactly how consummation should proceed. This wasn't general advice. It was specific, graphic guidance on positions, timing, and techniques that would ensure pregnancy from your first encounter. Roman fertility priests carried detailed manuals describing the correct way to consummate marriage. They would actually enter the bridal chamber to inspect the bed, arrange specific objects around the room, and sometimes remain present to ensure the rituals were followed properly. You were required to make offerings to fertility gods during the intimate encounter itself. This meant stopping in the middle of consummation to pray, burn incense, or perform specific gestures that honored Priapus, the god of fertility and masculine virility. But the most disturbing aspect was the family involvement. Your new mother-in-law was expected to remain nearby throughout your wedding night, ready to provide coaching and ensure you were fulfilling your religious duties correctly. Some Roman families positioned mothers right outside the bridal chamber door, calling out instructions and corrections. If you showed too much enjoyment, you could be accused of being impure. If you didn't seem to be trying hard enough, you could be accused of failing your religious obligations. The goal wasn't mutual pleasure, it was efficient reproduction under divine supervision. Roman fertility rituals included consuming bizarre substances before and during consummation. Brides were forced to drink mixtures containing animal reproductive organs, fermented plant matter, and sometimes human bodily fluids that were believed to enhance fertility. Some rituals required interrupting consummation multiple times for prayer and offerings. Couples had to stop their intimate encounter whenever certain religious bells rang, perform specific rituals, and then resume on command. The natural flow of intimacy was completely subordinated to religious requirements. These rituals could extend the wedding night for hours, turning what should have been a private moment into an exhausting religious endurance test. And when it was finally over, the morning brought the most humiliating tradition of all. The most humiliating part of Roman weddings happened the next morning, when your private pain became public celebration. This final tradition reveals just how completely Romans had stripped marriage of any dignity or privacy. As dawn breaks, you're awakened not by your new husband, but by a parade of female relatives who have come to inspect the evidence of your wedding night. They march into your bridal chamber while you're still naked and vulnerable, ready to examine both you and the bedsheets for proof of successful consummation. The bloody sheets from your wedding night aren't privately disposed of. They're displayed like trophies. Your mother-in-law carries them through the house, showing them to guests who have remained overnight specifically to witness this moment. Some Roman families even hung the stained sheets from windows so neighbors could see the evidence. But the sheet display is just the beginning. You're required to appear before the assembled families and formally announce that consummation occurred. You have to describe your experience in enough detail to satisfy the crowd that it was legitimate, regardless of how traumatic it actually was. Roman morning after ceremonies included detailed questioning about the specifics of your wedding night. Female relatives would ask explicit questions about pain levels, duration, and your husband's performance. These weren't private conversations. They happened in front of extended family and sometimes community leaders. If the physical evidence wasn't convincing enough, or if your answers didn't satisfy the questioners, your marriage could be declared incomplete. This meant repeating the entire process. Another night of public consummation with witnesses. Another morning of humiliating inspection and questioning. The most disturbing aspect was the required emotional performance. Regardless of how you actually felt, traumatized, hurt, or violated, you were expected to express gratitude and happiness. Roman brides had to thank their families for arranging such wonderful marriages and praise their husbands for their skill and gentleness. Failed mourning ceremonies became public scandals that could destroy entire families. If you couldn't convincingly portray your wedding night as successful and enjoyable, both your family and your husband's family faced social ostracism and financial ruin. Some Roman women spent years practicing the emotional performance required for their morning after ceremony. They rehearsed expressions of gratitude, memorized appropriate responses to intimate questions, and learned to display bloody sheets with pride rather than shame. The ceremony concluded with a feast where your consummation was toasted and celebrated by everyone who had witnessed your capture, inspection, and morning interrogation. You were expected to sit smiling while guests made jokes about your lost virginity and raised toasts to your husband's sexual prowess. These 5 traditions reveal the horrifying truth about Roman marriage. It wasn't about love or partnership. It was about the systematic conquest and public humiliation of women, disguised as romance. The Romans were the most advanced civilization in the ancient world, with sophisticated laws and beautiful love poetry. But they also created wedding traditions so traumatic they would be considered organized assault today. What makes these practices truly disturbing is how completely they were integrated into respectable society. Families orchestrated the trauma, religious authorities blessed it, and entire communities celebrated it. These traditions remind us that societies can normalize virtually any level of cruelty if they create sufficient cultural justification. Roman wedding customs weren't aberrations. They were the logical result of viewing women as property and marriage as a transaction. The next time you see a romantic movie set in ancient Rome, remember these traditions. Behind the marble columns was a wedding system designed to traumatize women and celebrate their pain as entertainment.